Final Fantasy Tactics and Triangle Strategy are both really similar games. Both of their stories follow some of the same themes: political conflict, corruption of religious institutions, place of social activism in society, and maybe most importantly, the price of power. They also have very similar gameplay systems, turn-based tactics where each unit moves one at a time and the direction they're facing matters, varied characters and classes with different mobility, support, and attack options. All this stuff culminates into Triangle Strategy almost feeling like it could be a spiritual successor of Final Fantasy Tactics. However, since completing these games back to back, I think one of them is a much more complete package. Spoiler alert, it is the game that's almost 30 years newer. I want to get this out of the way now that I am by no means disrespecting FFT's legacy. I'm sure Triangle, as well as countless other games, probably wouldn't even exist if their developers weren't heavily inspired by Final Fantasy Tactics in some capacity. The reason I'm making this video is just to analyze the gameplay and narrative design within both of these games and highlight how the genre has evolved over the decades. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. First, let's talk about the narrative design in both of these games. Pretty early on in Triangle Strategy, the kingdom, or the duchy of Aesfrost, schemes up an excuse to invade Glenbrook, aka your kingdom, and claim it for themselves. Soon after that, the game makes you and your party make a key decision. Do you A, ally with Aesfrost and help them further their efforts against another house within your kingdom, or B, retaliate against the hostile takeover by aligning your house with a third party, which is the Kingdom of Hyzant. I really enjoyed when this game let us make decisions like that. Giving the reins to the players allows us to shape the story in several different ways based off of our values, and this game does a great job of showing you that there's really no right answer, no matter what you choose. But going back to this first decision, I really put myself in Serenoa's shoes here. So House Wolfort knew about the takeover and how it was founded on a completely dishonest claim. And even though Aesfrost promised autonomy and safety in exchange for recognition and compliance, I knew that we couldn't believe them. If their entire occupation of Glenbrook is based on a lie, then how am I going to know that that's not going to continue in the future when it's convenient or when House Wolfort becomes a threat to them in some way? So despite the fact that Aesfrost has ostensibly the most powerful military in the game and would most likely end House Wolfort if I stood up against them, I decided that I would stand on principle and retaliate against them using the help of the third party. Now I will admit, looking back, that most of these decisions didn't really matter too much in the end, but that's not really my point. Even though the majority of these choices are going to lead you generally in the same direction, it's just the fact that you get to make them that changed everything for me. Because now, all of a sudden, these complex moral questions get imposed on the player, and first-time players will expect all these choices to have some major gameplay implications, even though they might not always. Triangle Strategy looks at us directly and asks, do you align yourself with the evil empire who literally just killed your king, or the strange religious state that definitely has ulterior motives and is most likely racist against your wife? It's the choices like this that culminated to a story that kept me locked in pretty much all the way through the end of the 100-hour campaign. In contrast, I think this is a place where Final Fantasy Tactics has had some trouble capturing my interest. I've heard a lot of people say that the story had trouble drawing them in since it's a little too complicated, and it is complicated, don't get me wrong. I just don't think complexity is the main reason that prevented me from getting lost in Final Fantasy Tactics. I think it just wasn't engaging enough of a narrative for me. Let me get this out of the way. I did find parts of the story really interesting. FFT felt so rooted in the human condition. The final scene where it finally clicked that Ramza and Delita weren't going to team up to kill God and live happily ever after was really cool, especially given this genre's, traditions. And the character of Delita was really one of my favorites. Really, at his core, he was a politician playing power games in the background as you did all of the work. And after all of that, just to get killed by who we thought was a pawn in the chess game he was playing. I wanted to highlight some of the places where this story shined so you can understand that I really did enjoy FFT's story overall. It just didn't stick with me the way that Triangle Strategies did. To be really clear, the point I'm making here is more descriptive than prescriptive. Though both games are similar both in substance and structure, Triangle Strategy captured my attention way more, largely due to decision making via the skills of conviction, while FFT was much more obtuse and hard to pay attention to. And I don't really have suggestions on how I would make FFT's story more engaging, so this really could be a me issue. but I do know how it felt to painstakingly deliberate all of the decisions you made in Triangle Strategy, and I wish there was something in Final Fantasy Tactics that would help the story kind of find its way into my head at that level of intensity. Okay, let's change gears and talk about gameplay for a bit. So funny enough, I think the title gives it all away. Strategy versus tactics. I spent a lot of time in FFT making tactical decisions. If the enemy unit goes here, I'll back up and go there. If they down one of my units, I reposition to prioritize survival over dealing damage, etc. But the major problem I found that kept recurring in this game was how many of the battles, especially bosses, devolved into a game of hot potato. Let's look at the Kukulin boss fight, for example. So I know a lot of you must have played the Evilise Chronicles recently. Could you explain how to beat this guy to someone who doesn't know anything about the game? You know, assuming that they have some background in how Final Fantasy games work or how tactical games work in general. What I'm assuming most people did was to spread their team out into a semicircle or circle if possible. 1 or 2 healers towards the back, an archer or another ranged attacker, melee class to get up close, and then maybe a mage or summoner in there for extra DPS. That's pretty much what I did, at least. I rotated around the boss, trying to whack him as much as possible, reprioritizing to healing / reviving / removing doom and all those other debuffs to my party members as needed. And I'll be honest, I can't think of a meaningfully different way to tackle this boss, and that unfortunately made this gameplay feel a little bit forgettable. And I think this problem remains for pretty much every single boss in Final Fantasy Tactics. Now, does this vary at all for the non-boss battles in this game? I would say yeah, there are a handful of good fights that have multiple enemies and some strategic variety, but my point still remains. There's too many fights in this game that are just too simplistic. Now let's compare this to a battle in Triangle Strategy. Let's take a look at the Roselle Village fight in Chapter 11. Right off the bat, you can see that the potential for interesting gameplay decisions increases quite a bit, simply due to the larger number of party members and also the greater number of enemies. So here's how this map plays out. Your units are split into 2 tall buildings, and there's 1 boss near each of the 2 back portions of the map, each one prioritizing one of the 2 rooftops. The one closer to the back is a smaller, squishier assassin type unit who can target one of your units to become enraged and run out of position and try to attack him. The other one is a hard-hitting bruiser type with a ranged toss attack that can hit units all the way from the bottom of the building. He starts the fight much closer to your army and can even reach you within a turn, especially if Jerome sprints into the action right out of the gate. You can pretty quickly come up with several different strategies to deal with this chapter. One, you could prioritize the left building, keeping most of your forces there while keeping just a strong enough smaller army to the right. This right side could slowly pick apart the archers and other ranged units on the right side while holding Rufus at bay so he doesn't get too deep into your back lines. And then once the ranged units are dead, you can move the remainder of the right side army over to the left to help on that side. Option 2, you could use gens to make a much shorter path with his ladder ability to connect both of the rooftops. This would allow you to go back and forth between them quickly and potentially force the enemy into the relatively small choke point that is kind of between the 2 buildings. Another option is you could strategically let 1 or 2 units at a time through your defenses and just push them off of the tall parts of the building, dealing massive damage. All of these strategies are viable, or would potentially be viable, and they would all be something you could draw on a piece of paper. Going back to Final Fantasy Tactics, I could think of maybe 2 battles in the whole game that made me think this much about the X's and O's, for lack of better words, of how to play through a battle. I think this example illustrates why I liked the gameplay in Triangle Strategy so much more. Just like the decision making in the story, I found myself making much more interesting and complex decisions within each battle. Each map would start with some semblance of a game plan that required careful unit positioning and a drawn out, either mentally or physically, plan of attack. And all that planning and decision making kept me glued to the screen for pretty much every single chapter. Alright, wrapping things up here. I know I've been pretty critical here, but I just wanted to reiterate that I think Final Fantasy Tactics is a really good game. The story was really interesting in a lot of different parts, and it pioneered, or at least was an early adopter of, some really revolutionary design and gameplay systems. But all that considered, I much preferred Triangle Strategy and consider it to be a superior game. If anyone hasn't played these games and wanted a recommendation, I would say play FFT first and then give Triangle Strategy a shot. But those are just my thoughts. Chances are I missed something, so please let me know what I'm missing in the comments. I'm all ears and open to replaying some of these games to see if that ends up giving me like a different perspective. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.